gets a little busier in the course of the day. Everybody, thanks for getting up. So yesterday we had Leonid moonlighting as a sociologist, and today you get a political scientist trespassing. Similarly, I'm not a public finance person. I started, but I've been working on issues of public administration, and I found I was getting more and more interested, also in the expenditure side of things. So, there is a certain amount of trespassing across disciplinary boundaries as well. So any inaccuracies hopefully will be forgiven. We are a very small group, and I know we're an extremely mixed group, and some of the, not just the public finance part, but the public management discussions may be new to people. So what I would suggest is that if there's anything, I'm totally happy to be interrupted. It's a small group, and I don't mind if we merge the presentation and the discussion sections to a certain extent. So I think I'll do a bit of improvising here as well. I've got my slides, but let's see what happens. My basic idea, my point of departure is, as Jesko was reading out already from the abstract, this whole discussion of public and private, which came up first really in the early 90s. There was some literature on that, if you recall, and most of that focused on defining private. And then there was a whole debate about, can you really talk about a concept of private in a post-communist context? How do you understand private? Is it to be understood as the pertaining to the individual, or is it something about that could be applied to civil society? So that was sort of the gist of the discussion. What I'm trying to get at is the other side of this. I'm trying to get at my point of departure is that in fact the public side of this is equally problematic. But the basic idea that many studies have approached is, that they've said, we start, in the year 1990, we start with essentially this mishmash of public and private, and that there is no real distinction, and that is sort of that cliche that goes around, page up, page down. Those of you who are, into the literature, T.H. Rigby had this phrase of the mono-organizational society that became very famous, and USSR incorporated these ideas that claimed that we don't have public and private, we have a single organizational space. And Rigby said, he actually explained that. He said, well, nearly all social activities are run by hierarchies of appointed officials under the direction of a single overall command. So this interpretation says, it's a single organization, hence, the USSR incorporated idea, which, drawing the parallels with a corporation, a single organization. And of course, then everything is kind of mixed. It's all inside the same organization. And, there is no distinction. And, then the interpretation in the early years of transition was that, we have to split up the two. We have to bring apart, we have to essentially recreate, we have to create a new, private sphere, or, a private capitalist sphere. And, that is the essence of the thinking behind privatization. The depoliticization, and the whole discussion of privatization, was always that, we need to extricate these activities from this, mono-organizational mishmash. And we have to, if you read Osland and these people, they say we have to depoliticize, which is often argued in a very naive way. And, public is sort of the residual. It's what's left over once you extricate these private activities. And there wasn't really much thought as to, well, what's the private side, the public side, how does the public side define itself? And you saw some of the difficulties. I was just thinking about that when we had the introduction by your dean, and the Russian equivalents he used was lichny and общественный. Well, when you talk about the public as in public sector, of course, общественный isn't really what you want to talk about. That's not it either. So even the terminology becomes tricky. And actually, to preempt what I'm going to say later, I've started to think that actually the terminology in Russian that you have to look at, it's not not even государственный, probably it's not общественный, but it's probably you have to look at бюджетный and this whole terminological context. I just had a fascinating discussion with a linguist actually, and we said maybe we should do a joint study of this, because there is a whole linguistic context, of course, that could be explored. So what I want to do is focus on the public side, and with regards to the public sector, then you often get this argument as a consequence that people don't really have a clear idea of what is the public. And why am I interested in this? I did some studies, and they really led me to wonder about this. They led me to wonder about what are people's normative ideas of the public sector. And I will give you the background. I did a study a couple of years ago that's now soon to be published. I'm doing some fine tuning, but that had to do with the collapse of the Forest Service, or the dismantling of the Russian Forest Service through the 2006 forest legislation. And you may not have followed this in detail, but essentially that new law on forests that radically decentralized the Forest Service to the point that it basically doesn't really exist anymore, and it was those tasks were devolved to regions. And the fascinating thing about this for political scientists was that it was really hard to tell the usual story. You couldn't do the usual story, who wins from this, because there really weren't any winners in this entire story, and there really wasn't anyone who actively pushed for it. When I looked at, how did this come upon, it was one of these things you dream of as a social scientist, total genuine research puzzle. Something gets done and no one benefits that you can see. And as a result of the process, in fact, really everybody was worse off. In a sense, I did some interviews at the time with, people who had looked into the numbers. There's a specialist, from Greenpeace who's, followed all the numbers. Alexei Yareshenko, he told me, he said, well, as a result of this, the regions didn't want it. Maybe a couple of strong regions, wanted, most of them weren't interested. Industry really didn't want it. The federal government, as a result of this, these were figures from, a couple of years ago, but, at the time he said, federal transfers as a result of this reform are about 4 or 5 times as high as before. So, this was something that was pushed by the federal government, but, they're paying 4 times as much as before. So they didn't benefit, so why does it happen? And I looked into the story, and my interpretation is that, essentially what happened is it was a legislative attempt that had a different goal. It was supposed to, the goal at the time, those of you who may have followed this, was the privatization of forest lands. So it was about something completely different. And that didn't work out because there was too much resistance. And the dismantling of the administrative structures is more or less an accidental result. In organization theory, we call it a garbage can process. Where you end up with a result that may have nothing to do with the program problems that were discussed before. My basic argument is, looking at this, you have a process, it's intended to get something completely different. And, then it turns, you end up with a solution that is, seized upon at the last moment that, no one was really pushing for. And at that moment, the decisive moment, I think, is that, the forest management structures had lost the support of their allies in the environmental movement, and that has to do with the management practices they were using in the 1990s, because they had really commercialized their activities, not illegally so, legally, but it was part of their statutes, but it had alienated their allies. I mean, that is my key, that I think is crucial to understanding what happened. And part of that had to do with the fact that, all they did was legal, but, it violated, I think, certain norms that were part of the institutional structure, really of Russian forestry, going back to, pre-Soviet times, which said that there is a boundary line between conservation activities on the one hand, between that side and between the economic side, and that's supposed to be done by other institutions. Now that is a very specific boundary that actually is if you look at other European countries, it's not the same thing everywhere. It's something that's specific to a particular sector, and that's specific to the way this particular sector was set up in Russia. But I think there's also a general problem here, which is that. I think you can transfer that argument to other areas, that people had problems with the way that public management worked in the 1990s. Now, why would that, if you start to think about that, what does that mean? And, I submitted that manuscript and people were like, oh gee, this is interesting, can you document this? And so I started thinking about, can I document this? And it's really difficult, it's a gut level thing. If you read through, if you were following the Russian press in, the 1990s, I can say that, definitely, if you read commentaries, and you got all these, funny things that public actors did, and there's always this clear sense of disapproval by the journalists. But that is, a gut feeling that you get, following the press. I would have to go back probably and do a content analysis, and that's pretty tricky because where do you even start? How do you define keywords? One thing that could be fun to do at some point is to team up with somebody who does survey work of the type that Leonid described, because I don't think this is something that's been covered. There were also all kinds of questions at different times about what do you think about privatization. But there are surveys on corruption, and that could easily be extended to ask questions. But how do you think, what is appropriate for a public body to do? And my assumption is that people do have very clear ideas about what the public sector is supposed to do. I don't think there is a vacuum. I think that, whole, cliche that, people don't, it was all, mixed up, and, people didn't have clear ideas about appropriateness. I think that's completely wrong. They had clear ideas, and my hunch, and, this is still very experimental, but, my hunch would be that there are two sources for that. On the one hand, you have the Western management thought that, of course, is a shared thought. You have Weberian ideas about bureaucracy, and people who talk about this always say, well, but you didn't really have a Weberian bureaucracy in Russia. Yes, but you certainly had a Weberian ideology, or also Fayol's thoughts on management. All of that really comes up around 1900, and it is part of the shared legacy of both sides of the Iron Curtain, and it's something that I think has been internalized. And then on the other hand, I suspect, when you look at the development of public management after the fall of communism, and that's something I've seen in other case studies, one thing you see is, there's an importance of the institutional boundaries that exist before 1990. Between, different types of public bodies, and, that has to do with the public finance side of it. Because one of the more remarkable things is that, when you look at, semi-public bodies now, very often, these semi-public bodies are bodies that, before, to the extent that they existed before transition, were not budget-ness organizations, but, they were, middling organizations. They were, nie-budgetny. They were already in that gray area. So there do seem to be some continuities. So, that's the two areas that I think are crucial. Now, why is this important? It's important because when you look at, because what happens in modern public management in general today is that you have just such a blurring of the, of public and private. That's it becomes extremely important. The discussion, and that is a Western discussion over the past 20 years, has been, really about the distinction between public and private in the public sector. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the term new public management. Not the historian, so I think I'm going to explain. You've had a movement over the past 20 years that tries to get away from Weberian public management, and that in essence says what you have to do is to make the public sector more like the private sector in order to make it more efficient. And one of the buzzwords that you may recall, at the beginning of the Clinton administration, there was a very popular book called Reinventing Government. That's part of this whole wave. And, the argument is that, the public sector is bloated and, it's not efficient. And in order to become more efficient, what you need to do is to really import principles from the private sector and to make the public sector more like the private sector. Now, if you think about, how does a Weberian, to illustrate this, there's a table that's often used. Let me scroll down to this. Here we go, that's the standard. Can everybody see this? The screen is a little smaller than usual. So maybe you should come up closer, because normally you would have, double the size and then this should display. But this is, what's usually used to explain this. This is the classical bureaucracy, under Weberianism, and some of you may recall, the different principles of Weberian administration, which is that, the primacy of, office. It's not the person, it's the office holder. It's, impersonal. It's, written administration. It's, the hierarchy. This actually is, also comes from, Fayol, the unity of command, which then, of course, translates in the Soviet part of them. That's the whole in a nutshell thing, right? That's where it comes from, the unity of command. You have clear responsibilities. And you have procedures, the importance of procedures. Now, with the new public management, you get a radical shift, that starts in, New Zealand. New Zealand starts playing around with this. And, what you do is that you say, okay, we're not going to pay as much attention to procedures. We're going to have managers in the public sector, and we will give them more or less free hand to, to do whatever they think they need to do. We won't judge them by procedures, we will judge them by outcomes. They have to figure out the best way to get there. The problem with that is that, of course, you know, in order to do that, you have to have some way of measuring that. You have to have some way of defining those outputs, what those outputs, and you know, that's already where the problems start. You need to, you look at the outputs, you have to define them first, which is actually quite difficult sometimes in the public sector because many public organizations have multiple goals, and they have goals that are difficult to specify in quantitative terms, you know, since, you know, very often, you know, if you measure it, it's easiest if it's, you know, if you have quantitative targets. So very often what happens is that you have a process where, you know, if there's multiple goals, then, you know, the goals that get emphasized are the ones that can be quantified. And, you know, then, you know, another drawback is you have to measure this. And, you know, any of us who've, you know, work in, I think, you know, this is also happening and is starting to happen in Russian universities. I've read some pieces by, you know, Russian accountancy specialists, you know, this whole invasion of, you know, cost accounting in the university sector and trying to measure output and, you know, number crunching and, you know, going down to the level of individual units. That's where this comes from. Because what you also try is to, you know, break things down to smaller units and to make these responsible. And that means that you change how you do budgeting. The old, you know, classical budgets is everything is specified, you know, down to the each, you know, budget lines. You know, these, you know, straka, everything is, you know, specified. If it's not in that item, you know, then tough luck. You would need to get it reclassified. It does have, you know, huge drawbacks. And, you know, the way that public management, you know, new public management deals with this is that you say, okay, you know, we'll do block budgets, we'll give you a chunk of money, and you decide for what you use it, and you can use it for, you know, grants, or you can use it for, you know, to pay people tuition, or you can use it to bring in lectures. You know, you deal with it, you behave like a manager. We're not going to tell you in detail what to do. So that's one thing that happens, and, you know, then another thing that happens is that you get a breakup very often of the old ministries, that you get, you know, something that it goes by the buzzword of agencyfication, that you create agencies. So the idea is that, you know, you do a functional review of tasks in the public sector, and you say, well, you know, what if this, you know, really needs to be a public task? You do a functional review, and, you know, then you say, you know, well, there are, you know, certain functions that are policy making, there, you know, that are regulatory, but, you know, there are also, you know, other functions that are really service oriented, and these should be handled by different organizations. And all of that, incidentally, you know, that's something that, you know, that's a process that, you know, was also looked at in Russia in, you know, the, you know, first Putin administration, you know, the Kozak Commission, they did, you know, just that, you know, a functional review, and, you know, set up a hierarchy of, you know, agencies. A lot of, you know, this management thinking was transferred. So we've got these, you know, things spreading. I mean, why did it happen, you know, at the time? You know, by the way, you know, if anyone is wondering, you know, why does it happen? It's part, of course, of the whole, it has to do with the privatization and, you know, neoliberal movement. But it also, it's not quite as simple, but, you know, at the time, you know, it really happened because there were budgetary constraints. It's not, you know, quite as clear-cut to say, you know, this is a really evil thing, because a big part of it is that there were higher expectations towards services, and people said, you know, public services are really crappy, we expect more. And, you know, I think Leonid actually has done some work on that, you know, services in the public sector, and, you know, how can that be improved? You know, part of it was that, you know, people, you know, didn't put up with, you know, you go into a government office and you get talked down to. So the service orientation is a motivation for this. How do you make the public sector more responsive? And, you know, then another motivation is the 1970s economic constraints, so, you know, saving money. And of course the two of them are contradictory. So you already have contradictory goals, and, you know, then, you know, you have this ideological shift that goes on at the same time, a shift towards markets, a shift towards privatization, and all of this comes together. So, you know, what happens when you transfer this to, you know, I've already, you know, discussed, you know, a lot of these principles, you know, were transferred to transition countries, and, you know, then there's a huge debate about it, not just for transition countries, but also for developing countries. You know, does this really make sense? Is this something that, you know, we should adopt? I've hinted at some of the problems, you know, with this type of management in general. You know, it's terribly difficult when you have to do performance management, and, you know, to do that well, and to do it without wasting additional resources. And people have argued even for, you know, Great Britain, that, you know, Great Britain spent so much money on doing performance evaluations that, you know, that really eats up any efficiency gains you get from this whole exercise. You know, you spend so much money, and you know, if you think about, you know, what British scholars, you know, tell you, you call these evaluation exercises, it's incredibly resource consuming. It gets much more problematic when you transfer it, you know, especially to a developing country context. And, you know, somebody wrote a, you know, lovely piece. This was a World Bank guy, you know, no less. He wrote a lovely piece with the title of "Don't Try This at Home." Why, and you know, the subtitle, you know, something like, you know, why the New Zealand reforms are not a good idea for Mongolia. The problem with this is that if you have this kind of table, if you have the setup, you give an enormous amount of discretion to managers, and if you don't have very strict control, you know, in place, you know, so there's a debate, you know, should you do this? And of course, if you have a highly formalized context, it gets difficult. And one thing that interests me is, and you know, that I'm, you know, currently exploring is, you know, how do people here, you know, how does, you know, for instance, the Russian public or the Georgian public, or, you know, how do post-Soviet populations, you know, what do they think of this? Because, you know, what you see now, you know, to a certain extent is a rollback of this, you know, kind of commercialization. And I think what I'm trying to show, and I won't go into all the details here because that you know, then, you know, really gets too complex. There was a partial rollout, and that was fostered. It's very complicated because you had a decentralized reality. So, you know, on the one hand, you have certain normative expectations, and, you know, they're, you know, really, I'll give you the larger table. They're really very much, I think, shaped by these, you know, classical libertarian ideas. You know, I think that's, you know, very much around, you know, if you read newspaper commentaries, or, you know, if you think, you know, yourself, if you question yourself, you know, what do I think, you know, if I hear something, you know, a public office, that's probably what I've got in mind. Probably think of this. I probably don't think of something like that. So that's, you know, one side of the story, but, you know, the other side of the story is, of course, that if you think about what is administrative reality, that actually, you know, there was a whole lot of messing around, you know, even before, and, you know, that's the interesting side. Once you start looking at the public finance side, there was a whole, this is actually something that suits many actors in the administration quite well. And that is, you know, my assertion, you know, because it really overlaps with what they were doing anyway. And, you know, it's quite astonishing, you know, when you read a lot of the technical literature on public finance, you know, what they all say is that, you know, there really wasn't much expenditure control in the old system. That, you know, basically, you know, people, you know, at, you know, a mid-level of ministries, you know, they had quite a lot of leeway to do what they wanted because, you know, it was very hard to control ex post. And of course, you all are familiar, I'm sure that's, you know, a big, you know, topic at the center, you know, all the discussions about economic soгласование and, you know, informal bargaining and so on. So what this comes down to is that when you try to extend this classical table into the post-Soviet sphere, you have the ideology, which is pretty much, Weberian, with certain modifications. Proceduralism, is modified because of the primacy of political considerations, but, it's still procedures. You have, of course, the unity of command. There's even a Russian, that's Единое началье. That was a big part, even in Stalinist management thinking. Vertical hierarchies, low discretion. In fact, I just saw that at the hotel when I arrived. You have these extremely low discretion by people, at the bottom of the hierarchy. Tasks are handled inside the hierarchy. Monitoring. But, in practice, and, that's when you read the tax literature, when you read the expenditure literature, people, working for the IMF, like we're looking at the system and say, well, yeah, but, in reality, the amount of control over how public money was actually spent inside the apparatus was quite low. For a variety of reasons. Because of the structure of the budget system, because in the Soviet budget structure, different kinds of expenditure were not assigned to agencies. You couldn't follow it agency by agency, but it was by sectors. So that made it really difficult to look at individual agencies and say, how are you spending it? This is not, of my own batch, but, I'm lifting this, from the technical literature that, the IMF has produced afterwards. And the budgeting techniques, they weren't screened, as they went through the administration. Everything that happened in the last stage of the spending process. One of these people says the Ministry of Finance only aimed for cash control over the spending ministries, but not of prior stages of spending by the lower level spending units. So in essence, you don't really, the Weberian ideology doesn't really translate into how things are actually handled. And that, they claim that, this is something that contributed to the arrears crisis, because you had this amount of, unsupervised spending behavior by parts of ministries, concentrating controls, just on the cash side of things, without controlling the commitments of SUs or spending units. It didn't only lead to disruptions in resource allocation within ministries, but it also meant that spending units accumulated arrears to the rest of the economy. So this is what they claimed is that, this was behind, a big part of the mess, and then, the budgetary mess in the 1990s. So you have this de facto setup that actually starts looking a hell of a lot like the new public management side, except that it's not officially sanctioned. It's not something that, in contrast to new public management, where we say, oh, this is great, this is a panacea. It's something that exists informally, and that, but it really overlaps. So you can see that, on the one hand, this is not something I think that overlaps with most people's ideas of what the public sector should do, but at the same time, it was something that fit remarkably well with actual realities, and that must have suited a bunch of people in the administration really well. And then if you add to that, and I've been trying to sort my slides here, but it was a bit messy because I didn't get to print them out before I left. So I guess that's after this one. And it's aided by that, distinction between budgetary and non-budgetary activities. That's an extra moment. The overall budget structure, but then, the solid, I think that, really is crucial. And, in fact, it's really funny when you start looking at the English language literature, they even, and they try to translate this into English, this whole, nie budget-ness. And, these IMF publications, they actually start talking about the state sector versus the government sector. The government sector being, the budget-ness side, and, the state sector being everything. So it's actually a little, even, tricky bringing this back into English. But, there were these mechanisms. There were, legitimately within the Soviet setup, there were ways in which public bodies were allowed to charge fees, certain types of fees, well, you had the road user fees, for instance, you had extra budgetary funding, so, there were certain tools in place. And I'm not saying that you have a direct continuity, but I think, what you could argue is that just like the arguments about the constitutional setup of the Soviet Union, there's this, very common argument that says what happens is the Soviet constitution sets up the fault lines for the breakup, because you have a partly really theoretical constitution, the rights of the republics, and then, when that comes under strain, you have a split up, exactly along these lines. So you don't have the same thing, before and after, but, the way that things are set up, the institutional setup, even if, you shouldn't overinterpret it, but, it does have effects. It does set certain, fault lines. And people take these criteria and, they still need to do things more or less legally, and they take the tools that are at their disposal at the time and, they start using it. And they start using these commercial activities, they start using these non-budgetary, extra budgetary tools. And of course then that skyrockets. What you have is, middle-level bureaucracies, and I would, a lot of people who've written about this, it's part of the corruption literature. I think that's a bit unfair because it's a dual thing. In a lot of cases, it does open up lots of space for corruption on the one hand, but on the other hand, and I'm sure many of you can think of cases where you simply have managers in the public sector, and I did a bunch of work on the forest sector, and that was quite common, and they were thinking about how the hell do we pay our employees, and where do we get the funds to pay our employees, and of course you could tell that story for the higher education sector, all these institutes renting part of their space. I remember when I was doing field work in Russia in the 90s, it was by invitation of IMEMO, and at some point suddenly there was a nice canteen, and that was because they had sublet 4 floors of that skyscraper, the IMEMO skyscraper, on the Orange Line. They rented 4 floors to ABB, and ABB set up a canteen, and suddenly it was a canteen that even had knives. If you remember that time when you went into all these canteens and you had to eat chicken with 2 forks. So ABB brought in knives. It was fantastic, and everybody was happy. And I guess there's no backlash against that, which I suspect is about grabbing the real estate of higher education institutions. But you get these activities, and not all of them are corrupt. A lot of them are about coping mechanisms. But it means using mechanisms, using all that discretion, doing things that use all of these management tools. And what I think then happens is you have public sector organizations in the 90s who really exploit all of this, and not everybody is happy with it, and the public echo to this, and that was what I think I really saw in the case with the Forest Service. That for the most part it wasn't even illegal, what they did. They used, certain loopholes in their charter, that said, you are allowed to do sanitary cuttings. They started logging, in a big way. But I mean, it was formally legal. It was a bit of a, bending of the statute, creative interpretation. And the trouble was that it took on such an extent that it really distracted from their main mission, because you had Forest Service units opening sawmills and engaging in commercial activity, and you got a kind of mission creep where they really didn't have time to deal with their core ecological tasks, and that cost them support. I think that's very plain. That it cost them support because traditionally whenever you had that divide between the industry and the Forest Service, you had environmentalists were on the side of the Forest Service, and that stopped. And I interviewed people who were involved in this legislative process at the time, and it was quite clear that they hadn't stepped in, they hadn't said, they had fought the privatization plans. They said, we're really against, forest lands being privatized to companies, but they had not stepped in a similar way to support the administration, which they, had before. If you look at the division lines, that those were the traditional alliances, and that split up following the commercialization. And where I'm exploring this lately is that I have started actually working on a research project now with some people that's supposed to be across countries. And what we want to look at is this move towards formation of agencies, towards agencification. And I've looked at this quite a bit for the Georgian case. And in a nutshell, what I'm trying to argue, I've done one case study that actually I can go around, where we looked at, that was with a former student of mine, we looked at the Georgian police guards units. And those were the old, basically the successors of the old, Vnivedomstvenная охрана. And it's a not very well-known story. I would write it a lot more assertively if I wrote it today, because essentially it's the dark twin of the Georgian police reform. And you've all heard about the Georgian patrol police reform, where they dismissed all the traffic cops and they created a new patrol police, and it's a wonderful white knight kind of story of anti-corruption. What is much less well known is that they had these guards units, which interestingly, they weren't part of the old ministry. They always, just like I was saying, the fault lines, right? They had a special status. When you go back, in Soviet times, these, they were not paid from ministry funds. They were paid from enterprise funds. When they were put, to enterprises, the enterprise had to pay for them. So they already had a special, not quite public, so to speak, status. And in 2004. I was in Georgia at the time. The Georgian government comes in and they start this huge drive towards creating public law agencies, which they called legal entities of public law. And they went all around and started trying to say, no, you have to create these things. And in fact, they went around and said, people from the Ministry of Finance in Georgia went around and said, the IMF wants us to create public law agencies, and which of your units are good for that? And when the IMF was told about this, they were like, oh my God, we think this is a really bad idea because it reduces transparency. I have copies of an exchange of emails with the local, res rep. So, the Georgians started adopting this, and, then they started using it for the guards units, and it was a very, it wasn't what should have happened. It wasn't, the perfectly neoliberal thing to do, because you have this agency, and, they're making tons of money from, being guards, from, operating the security system. At the same time, they're the regulatory body. They oversee the private security industry, and they compete with them. And they have a huge advantage competing with the private security industry because they had the right to bear arms, and the private bodies didn't. So it's from a point of view of economic ideology, this is a really total no-no. But it's something that the Saakashvili people, they said, we'll fix it. And then after a whole while, and they already turned it into a public law agency, and then they said, you know what, we made it a public law agency, and they gave it new advertising, but essentially left it in place. And we think, I can't prove it, but it's extremely probable that it was used as a slush fund for the Ministry of Internal Affairs. They got a bunch of money that they were supposed to use internally. They're extremely profitable, and it's very probable that money then went to the Ministry of Internal Affairs. What is clear is that they also soaked up employment. That a lot of the people that were fired from the old traffic police found employment there. So you can do the reform without too many disruptions. And the beauty of it, the absolute beauty of it for the government, was that it didn't count as state employment because it was a public law agency, and in the economic statistics that's services. So you have a number for services, but the people that work there don't count as state employees. So they were looking really nice as far as cutting public sector budgets. So it's a dual movement. You do something that it suits that mid-level of the bureaucracy. It accords with what they did before, because I've showed you that you have the de facto situation, and you take this new label and you transfer it to these agencies. So it's beautiful. It's sticking a new label on something, and it works very well because you get this overlap even before. I think I'll get to the end. I mean, basically, the theoretical implications. I'm writing this up for an article now, and there's been this whole discussion of institutional transfer, and many people, the theory that they use to look at that is the theory of institutional isomorphism. Which I think works really well, actually. And those of you who are not sociologists, it's an increasingly influential body of thought that looks at the way that institutions become similar to each other over time. And the original literature is on actually mostly North American schools, and the way which are decentralized. But the way they're set up, the way the management is set up, becomes more and more similar. And why is that? Traditionally, people in organization theory try to explain organizational forms by saying that it's a logical consequence of the functions. That's the classical form of organization, and you call that technological contingency. You look at the structure of tasks. And then the assumption is that the structure of organizations is derived from their tasks. And what this theory says is that no, you actually don't have a very clear relationship. You have organizational forms. There's a loose coupling. The organizational forms don't follow from what the organization does, but they are there for three reasons. Because, coercive, mimetic, and normative. What that means is coercive, because governments, for instance, require certain organizational forms. So they say, a public school, to receive federal funding needs to have such and such in place. Well, I'm from Germany, German associations, non-profits, there are also certain requirements, which is that you have an annual meeting of members. Even if it's your local martial arts club. I was doing martial arts in Germany, and you had to have a meeting, once a year where you had a formal protocol, and you had to elect a cashier, with a group of, 12 people. It was totally fiction, but it was something you had to do because it was something that was required to maintain your legal status. So that's the coercive side. The mimetic side is you simply look at what do other people do and you copy it. Some of you may recall the term management gurus. There's something, very similar in that you have management gurus and, there are fashions in management. And there's normative isomorphism because people share their ideas of, what is appropriate with others, and, transmission, for instance, happens through professional associations. What I would say is if you look at this process, it's a bit different. Because essentially what they did was they took this label and they stuck it in something that was already there. So you do have that loose coupling, and I think isomorphism works really well, but I would suggest, and that's what I meant to do in that article, that it's really a fourth form, weak form of isomorphism that I tentatively call camouflage isomorphism, where you take a label for purposes of legitimation. But the practices were already in place to a large extent, I would argue. So it's really fun from an organization theory point of view. It's not a classical institutional transfer, because what's transferred isn't so much, the actual practices, but, it's the ideological side, it's the, legitimatory side. And with this, really confusing and just to give you an idea of, where this is going within my discipline, I think I'll leave it at that, but I would be really interested in your ideas. It's, still, some of this is at a very early stage. I would love, in fact, I've talked to a bunch of people who, are excited by it, and, then, we say, oh, we really should explore this further. But of course, if you want to do a proper sociological study, that's a huge amount of work. But, potentially if anyone is up for it, I'm interested. So thanks for your attention.
Thanks so much. Questions from the audience?
I've exhausted you.
Well, I could ask something. So you talked about these international organizations, yeah? So you mentioned IMF.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, who are these organizations that pushed for the privatization of the public sector? That pushed for this greater distinction of private and public sector. And what did they say to the outcomes? So how content were they with the outcomes? I'm also asking this because lately I've been reading an article with my students about the global performance data in Tajikistan.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, from the Tajik perspective, it is very important to appear democratic. But then there are these, USAID and other organizations who also have an incentive in demonstrating positive outcomes of that kind of collaboration.
Yeah, the international community is really ambivalent about this. You have to distinguish, there's the agency reform, and then a certain amount of the stuff gets pushed. I guess I should open this again, I'm not quite sure. Probably shouldn't have pushed exit. And this isn't doing anything right now. Okay, I'll do it without the slides. Well, there's a couple of, there's the functional review, and there was, what, bodies like the Koila Commission did, and it didn't have as much. I think that was largely supported to say that let's do a review of what the government does. And of course, then that ended in the one gazillionth reorganization. I think the consensus was that it ended up with just another roundabout reorganization of ministries. There was a certain splitting of functions. In general, there is support for the idea that you should differentiate between functions. This Georgian case I was telling you about, the theoretical stance is that, this is not a good idea, and, it's clear why. If you have a body that is the regulator and at the same time it competes with the organization it regulates, it's absurd. It wasn't pushed, in this case, it wasn't something that, anyone was pushing terribly hard. Because, it was a peripheral agency, and there was huge support for the police reform, and, foreign actors are realists. They had certain priority areas, such as, customs, or the police reform, they invested money in that. And, they didn't look too closely at this. You don't, nitpick and, micromanage every little bit. The agencyfication, people are really ambivalent. That's the interesting part of the story. It's not something that was, that actively pushed. I told you that story about Georgia. You actually had, the Georgian finance ministry pretended that it was something the IMF wanted. And, the way I heard about it is that a good friend of mine was policy advisor at the agriculture ministry, and they had people going around in the agriculture ministry, so he writes an email to the res rep, to the IMF resident representative, and says, listen, this is what's going on, what's up with this? And the res rep says, oh my God, we really hate this, we think it's a terrible idea. And I'm friends with the man who was treasury advisor at the time, who had worked in Armenia for several years, and they said, we really don't like it because it reduces transparency, because the way these agencies were used was to create shadow budgets. And, you didn't, to hide debts or, to hide employment. So they didn't really like it. And, there's a good book, actually, by a bunch of people who were, in general, on new public management reforms. I've mentioned that before. There's a huge debate, should these things, does this make sense outside of New Zealand? Does this make sense in Mongolia? Don't do this at home. And a lot of the core people in this discussion have said, this is a really bad idea. There's an interesting study that was published, specifically, by the World Bank team, working on Russia, about implications of new public management for the Russian Federation by Neil Manning and a co-author. If anyone is interested, it might actually be interesting. They made an argument. They said it's dangerous. These things are dangerous because new public management. When you have a context of corruption, it makes things worse. It opens up. It gives all kinds of tools to corrupt managers. So what they argue is that you need to have a proper sequencing of, Weberian-style reforms and new public management-style reforms. And a lot of the civil sector reforms that go on, they're actually reforms that are intended to make things more Weberian. If you think about, civil service examinations, that's a classical Weberian-style reform. So, most experts argue that, you need a bunch of that, and you need proper sequencing. And, that specific book, Manning and Harrison, they argued that, they talk of something called the threshold of formality. That, once a public administration is, sufficiently formalized, then you can try to introduce these type of reforms. But when you have a context where you have a really high element of informality, then it can backfire on you. And I think that makes a lot of sense. So people are kind of ambivalent, and in general, these type of organizational reforms, the OECD is involved in this. They have a unit called Sigma that was at first working with accession countries, and it's now part of, they've now gone further east, and they're now active in countries of the eastern neighborhood. But they've never been terribly prescriptive, for the simple reason that, for instance, in the EU accession process, that is not something that's part of, you have this incredible detailed acquis that new member states had to take over, but that does not concern questions of institutional structures, because you have too much variety among the old member states for that. For that simple reason, it's not something where anyone has pushed clear templates. because there's simply too many templates floating around. Swedish management is, or British or German. I mean, it didn't make that much headway in Germany, for instance, because the structures are simply different. It really was something that, the New Zealand, really went totally all the way with it. The Brits did a lot of it. They're now rethinking some of it, but, they're probably the countries in Europe that did the most of, the countries that did the most, even, the US wasn't as much, but, it is all over the higher education sector. I saw that in Holland. I mean, we had an awful amount. You get a bunch of that in Sweden, of new public management, when everything gets monetized. And in fact, I had a project killed that, we had a proposal, some people from Novosibirsk wanted to do a project with my previous employer, a Tempus thing, curriculum development. It was, Novosibirsk and, some, Kazakh universities for, regional development. And I spent a month on the bloody thing and, wrote a proposal and, they wanted us to be the lead organization. And, they sent over 3 people at their own cost. And in the end, our budget people killed it because they said, the EU isn't subsidizing it enough. Because they said, if, new public management, because they said, if we have our people working on it, then, the mandates that are in the budget, they have to be completely reimbursed, and the rates that the EU is paying for that aren't high enough. So the fiction was that, if Barbara works on this, then, any day that, Barbara works on this is lost to us as an organization, and it needs to be completely refunded at a multiple of 1.7, because you also, then have to, finance, all the administrative staff along. So it's, not just my own salary prorated, but it's also, it's a multiple of 1.7. So that's new public management in action in the higher education sphere. And, we had a month of work wasted, and we had these poor folks from Novosibirsk who had, paid for 3 people to come to Holland for a week. I said, you explain it to them. I didn't do this. You explain it. But I mean, it is, it happens, but it's backtracking. It's getting, rolled back because people are, they look at things in, the UK and they say, how much money do we spend on these evaluations? Does it always make sense? In a lot of cases, these things, they get done, I mean, isomorphism, things get transferred and, not because they make sense. I read a fascinating study by a Russian accountant who actually, he does, publish on the higher education sphere, and he looks at, new accounting, accounting reforms and the way they're transferred into the public administration. And, he essentially says, as an accountancy specialist, this is total, it's nonsense, because the organizations that are supposed to employ it, they don't have the institutional capacity to use it. So this guy who's, he's a simple accountant, and he starts digging up sociological theory, and, he finds DiMaggio and Powell, and he says, hey, this really explains what goes on here. And, then he starts, bringing this institutional isomorphism theory into it, because he says, there's no other explanation. This stuff that makes no sense for Russian higher education. From an accountant's perspective, this is, bullshit. It doesn't fulfill a function. It's about legitimation. It's not about doing something useful. It's clearly about, certain, legitimatory purposes. So, then he digs up this isomorphism theory to explain it. It's cool. You get these, very narrow specialists, and, suddenly they start digging up sociological theory because they need it to explain what goes on in their field. Yes?
So to me, what you're talking about sounds a lot like discourse theory, if I were to put it in terms of literature I'm more familiar with. So for instance, my advisor Stephen Hawkins coined the phrase speaking Bolshevik to talk about, how the Soviet Union worked. The idea being that, the better you were in Soviet society of mastering the categories and vocabulary of the dominant discourse, the better you are at advancing yourself. So isn't this kind of, so your point about Georgia and your point about Russia, isn't it the dominant discourse has changed to like neoliberalism,
Yes.
right, and you know, new management theory. So you're saying what's underneath the hood hasn't changed very much, but people have changed what discourse.
It has changed. I mean, you know, I don't want to mislead you. I mean, that's, you know, why I spent that time, you know, talking about you know, the you know, fault lines. You know, I'm not saying that it hasn't changed at all. You know, you know, I hope I did make that clear. You know, because you know, some people make that kind of argument, and I think I'm more on the side of, I don't know, you know, like that, you know, bricolage stuff, that, you know, there are certain, you know, set pieces that people utilize. There are certain, you know, organizational tools. There's a toolbox that they employ, and, you know, what they do is shaped by that. But yes, you know, it's definitely not tabula rasa. It's not, you know, exactly the same, but it's not tabula rasa. And yes, you know, there is a huge element of, you know, just, you know, labels being important. And in fact, you know, I really need to get in touch with Alexei Yurchuk, because, you know, he had a paper, you know, some 10, 15 years ago that, you know, I see points where, you know, it really overlaps. And yes, you know, this is about, you know, in what language do you talk about things, you know, what labels do you, and I mean, that's something I found fascinating from the very beginning, I have to say, you know, also in my earlier research, that you have a transfer. Sometimes it's not so much a transfer of organizational forms, it's a transfer of words. And, you know, in order to, you know, really understand what organizations are doing, you have to go beyond the label. Yeah.
But why does the transfer of words influence the form? Like why does that? What is
Well, that's the
be?
question of what happens later on. Well, you know, you know, you take on, well, you get certain organizational forms like, you know, joint stock companies. Well, you know, my dissertation, you know, was actually was a case study of, you know, what happens with the old, you know, branch ministries. You know, that's, you know, hence the forest sector, because that was the ministry I looked at. And, you know, my idea was, you know, to say, you know, really, you know, the people that were in the ministry, the organizations, you know, you have these spin-off organizations, you have this whole new universe of spin-off organizations that, you know, that have the same phone numbers. And, you know, I bought one of the old phone directories. I've known people who did this systematically, you know, picking up several generations of phone directories. And you can trace, you know, you look at, you know, who's got that phone number, and, you know, what is that unit called now. And, you know, then they took on a new organizational form, and, you know, some of it was random, because there was we talked about this, I think, you know, yesterday when we were walking across the campus here. You know, this whole, you know, question, you know, are you a non-profit organization, or are you a commercial organization? And, you know, at the time, you know, then you became a commercial organization because it allowed you to have a bank account. And, yes, we discussed this because we were talking about this whole, you know, non-profit and foreign agents thing, and there was this interview with somebody in the Moscow Times who said, yeah, well, you know, okay, damn it, you know, we'll just become a commercial organization. You don't need to register for commercial. So it's the reverse, you know, move. And, but, you know, at first, a lot of these things were set up as joint stock companies, and, you know, then in the mid-90s, I did an interview. I was working on a project with people in Austria, and they flew in somebody from Tomsk. And in Tomsk, they had an association an employers association for the forest sector, which was organized as a joint stock company, but, you know, they had decided to turn it into a non-profit. So we said, why? And, you know, we did this, you know, interview, and it was a wonderful case where, you know, it really helps when you do 2-in-1 interviewing, because we were able to ask the same question again and again, and finally we got the actual answer, what I think was the real answer, which was that this whole association was essentially an extended arm of the regional department for the timber industry, and but, you know, as long as it was a joint stock company, they weren't allowed to be a member, but, you know, they were allowed to be a member in a non-profit. So they said, okay, you know, we'll reform it and turn it into a non-profit organization, and that way we can be one of the and, you know, again, you know, it was done for reasons that, you know, were remote from the ideology attached to it. It wasn't for ideological reasons. You know, they gave us an ideological story, but, I mean, organizational forms have consequences. They have legal consequences attached to them. So you do have the two sides. And the interesting thing actually that I didn't touch upon here, because it makes things even more complex. You know, so you stick this agency label on, you know, these organizations, and you know, the question that's really interesting is what happens in the long run. By adopting this framework, you know, is there a point when it starts to feed back into what you do internally? And I think there is, because the last few years, you know, there is a movement, and that has to do with, you know, of course this is something that legitimizes what you do, you know, also to the wider world and to international actors. And you can now see an increasing movement, you know, that actually, you know, goes on here as well as, you know, it goes on in Georgia, it goes on, you know, I think, you know, across the post-Soviet space to crack down on non-budgetary activities. It's, you know, this whole reform, you know, you may have heard, you know, this whole discussion of having the importance of the single treasury account, because so you can control expenditures, and that's something that's been pushed, you know, all along. So I think there is a point, you know, where you adopt this organizational form and it gives you legitimacy, but, you know, then there is, to a certain extent, you have to start acting in accordance with it. And I think at some point, I mean, it wasn't done as transfer, you know, originally so much. You know, I think originally it really was a camouflage kind of thing, but in the long run, I suspect that what you find is that, you know, then it does affect what you do, because you have to start walking the walk, so to speak. And, you know, there are people, you know, looking at what you do, and you know, there is that reverse movement, you know, the last 10 years of, you know, Clearmark account. I mean, the Georgian government, you know, to go back to that case, they went along with this, I suspect, because it gave them leeway. It wasn't so much a reform thing, but, you know, it was just, you know, a cool way to have, you know, it looked good, and at the same time, it gave them more wiggle room. And I mean, of course, Western governments too, they love having shadow budgets. You know, the German government hid, you know, most of the costs of unification and, you know, all kinds of subsidiary budgets, you know, specifically for independent funds and public law agencies, and that made things look a little less scary. So it's a common thing to do. It's not a post-Soviet thing to do. So, you know, for the government, it was attractive for that, not because they were in this area because they planned any great reform, but, you know, it looked good, and at the same time it gave them more freedom. But I mean, but if you look, you know, between then and now, they actually have reformed it, and it's a lot more transparent now. You know, these things are actually now in the public domain. They have less leeway in how they use funds. You know, they have to be on the single treasury account now, so there is progress. It's not a case of everything stays the same. So you probably could argue that, you know, you adopt these things and, you know, it does have consequences. You know, it's loose coupling, but it's not totally loose coupling. It, you know, it does, there are feedback loops. I'm not sure how we are time-wise.
We will still have, I don't know, 15 minutes if there is questions.
Yeah, well, I had a quite a naive question, I think. So maybe from your last answer, I also have an answer, but I still have this question. So in this model, in this institutionalist model, we have structures which are embedded on the local level in the countries, and structures which are world structures, language of this new public managerism, all these international organizations. So if there is any place for agents who can change something, is there any place for rational political actors, simply not rational political actors, who can do something apart from these structures which damage all the tryings of Mongolia reformists to do something, to change something, or maybe some progressive forward is progressive forward, east to east, and